Prime Minister Narendra Modi today hoisted the sacred flag on top of the Ram Temple, formally marking the completion of this monumental construction. The historic ceremony was followed by a defining message from the Prime Minister. He said that India must now achieve complete freedom from the colonial mindset. He reminded the nation by 2035, it will be 200 years since Macaulay's framework, which attempted to disconnect India from its cultural roots. He urged the country to take a national resolve to break free from the mindset of slavery which William Macaulay had imposed. He also set a focused 10-year time frame to reverse this lingering gulami mansikta, or slave mentality, as he put it. So what exactly is this Macaulay mindset which Prime Minister Modi referred to? A mindset that viewed British customs and values and Western systems as the ideal, almost treating Indian culture as inferior to what the West has to offer. It promoted English-based learning as the only civilized form of knowledge. It undermined India's own intellectual traditions. Even after political control weakened, the psychological influence remained in asking people to believe that progress meant imitating the West. Local languages and knowledge systems were dismissed, making generation after generation feel that their mother tongues were unfit for higher learning. Ancient practices and philosophies were portrayed as backward, causing many to distance themselves from their own cultural roots.
और बात भी महत्वपूर्ण है, और वो है गुलामी की मानसिकता से पूरी तरह मुक्ति। आज से 190 साल पहले 190 साल पहले साल 1835 में 1835 में मैकाले नाम के एक अंग्रेज ने भारत को अपनी जड़ों से उखाड़ने के बीज बोए थे। मैकाले ने भारत में मानसिक गुलामी की नींव रखी थी। 10 साल बाद यानी 2035 में उस अपवित्र घटना को 200 वर्ष पूरे हो रहे हैं। कुछ दिन पहले मैंने एक कार्यक्रम में आग्रह किया था कि हमें आने वाले 10 वर्षों तक उस 10 वर्षों का लक्ष्य लेकर चलना है कि भारत को गुलामी की मानसिकता से मुक्त करके रहेंगे।
So here are some excerpts that capture the tone and substance of William Macaulay's highly influential minute on Indian education. Macaulay famously claimed that a single shelf of European library was worth all the native literature of India and Arabia, dismissing centuries of Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian literature, philosophy and science as essentially worthless compared to European texts. Macaulay claimed that Sanskrit literature was inferior to even basic English school texts, using this to justify diverting funds from institutions that were teaching classical Indian languages. Macaulay highlighted Hindu rituals and abstract concepts to ridicule them, portraying the belief system as superstitious and primitive compared to Western philosophy. Macaulay also dismissed Indian science and Indian mathematics as so backward that it would make English schoolgirls laugh, using this to argue for replacing native knowledge systems with European science. So the grand Dhwaj Arohan ceremony concluded in the Ram Temple complex in Ayodhya. This brings to a culmination, a conclusion of the 3 ceremonies that were set in motion, with the groundbreaking ceremony that happened some years ago, the Pran Pratishtha that happened in 2024, and today the culmination of the completion of the Ram Temple complex in Ayodhya with the Dhwaj Arohan. What does this mean? And also the comments that the Prime Minister made while speaking at this Dhwaj Arohan ceremony, saying that almost 200 years ago, there was a British man who made a decision for then colonial India, from which, the shackles of which certainly we seem to be not able to break out of. And if India needs to be Viksit Bharat by 2047, then we need to break out of this Macaulay mindset. That's what the Prime Minister said. Let's try and make sense of this by speaking to Amish Tripathi, one of India's most well-known authors in English of history, of mythology. Thank you very much, Amish, for speaking with us. First of all, the Dhwaj Arohan. Why is this so important? Why is this the culmination of the completion of the Ram Temple complex? What is today's sort of events signify to you?
Well, when the Dhwaj goes up, when the Dhwaj Arohan happens, essentially, the temple is complete. So this is, of course, a critical and a celebratory moment for all of us Indians. There's a lot of symbolism to the Dhwaj as well. As I'm sure, I mean, you've explained to your viewers the symbols on it, the Om symbol, which of course all of us know, Surya, because the Ikshvaku dynasty, Lord Ram's dynasty, they were Suryavanshis, and the Kovidara tree as well. These were actually the symbols of the Ayodhya kingdom. This has been mentioned in the Valmiki Ramayana as well. These marks. So. And it wasn't mentioned in the later Ramayans. I don't know why was that memory forgotten, but it was there. This mark and the Kovidara tree in the Valmiki Ramayana, which is of course the original, most ancient Ramayana. So in a way, it's not just the completion of a temple; it is also a revival of a civilizational memory through the symbol on the symbols on the Dhwaj as well. So I think it's poetic, it's civilizational, it is India reviving itself and yet doing it in a modern way. The temple has been built with modern tech. L&T has done a
Yeah.
brilliant job out there. So it's the ideal mix of both, which India does so well:
But Amish,
civilizational memory and modernization.
tell me this. I found the comments made by the Prime Minister, part of his speech that he gave at this Dhwajarohan ceremony, quite interesting, where he said, and he's sort of touched upon this theme earlier as well, that somehow we Indians seem to be still stuck with this Macaulay mindset that we need to go back to our civilizational roots, this whole clutching on to English and this colonial thinking. We're still not able to shed it even after 75 years of independence. What do you think he means by that?
Zaka, I can't say I'd read the entire speech, but I did read parts of it. I don't think the Prime Minister was anti-English. He was pro-Indian languages. So to put it in a Hindi way, I'm a Hindi bhashi. हिंदी का प्रभाव बुरा नहीं है, हिंदी का दबाव बुरा है. And that is the balance that ideally we need to strike. In many parts of the world in the last 2.5 centuries, as the West has been so dominant, often modernization has come to mean westernization. Now, the reaction to this by many different non-Western countries has been on two extremes. Countries like Turkey, when Kemal Ataturk negated their traditions completely and went wholesale westernized. That was one approach. The other approach is what you see in some countries, like what Pakistan attempted, where they will reject modernization completely, and go back like 1,000 years culturally. Either of these two extremes are not good. What the Prime Minister, I suspect, was suggesting that we should modernize without westernizing, which means reform the things that need to be reformed. Like, for example, from this temple itself, the original Shilanyas was done by Chopalji, who was a Dalit Hindu, which is a reform to sadly the caste discrimination and the caste rigidities that had emerged in India in the last 1,000, 1,500 years, as Dr. Ambedkar had written in Who Were the Shudras. This was a good reform. But that doesn't mean we throw away everything. There are things that must be revived, must be celebrated, and we should celebrate that as well. Essentially, an ideal mix,
But
modern and
what,
yet Indian.
when he said this Macaulay mindset or this Gulami mindset, slavery mindset, I think it was not necessarily just about English. I think it was also about, we need some kind of Western approval or Western, the white man still has to approve of your ideas, your thoughts, your processes and so on. And if you look at the history of the last 70, 75 years, here in our own backyard, I mean, countries like Japan, post-Second World War, or China in the last 20, 30 years, the Southeast Asian tigers, have all, modernized, but not necessarily stuck to a colonial thinking or a colonial mindset. Do you think
I would
in India's case that's possible, or our history is different?
I would agree completely with the Prime Minister here. The slave mentality manifests in various ways. The obsession with fair skin, for example, is a reaction. The modern obsession, modern Indian obsession with fair skin, is a reaction to the invasions of the last 1,000 years, because our invaders were largely fair skinned. The Turks were fair skinned, as were the British, Portuguese, French, Dutch. And our ancient culture did not celebrate fair skin, was not anti fair skin, was not anti dark skin. Draupadi Ma was dark skinned, as we all know, and was considered very beautiful. Lord Shiva was fair skinned. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad spoke of prayers for a fair skinned or a dark skinned child, and both were celebrated. So that is one example. There are so many others. I could argue that perhaps even yoga has become popular now because many Westerners have discovered it. 30, 40 years ago, I come from a traditional family, so we did yoga, when it was not fashionable to do yoga, and we would have probably been called Ponga Pandits, for that. This constant seeking of Western approval and seeing ourselves from a Western lens has to be done away with. Another example, so many educated Indians believe that India was not a country before the British came, which is again not true. There are enough textual evidences from the Vishnu Puran to various others, to prove that India was indeed culturally a nation. But that does not mean that we should not reform things that need reforming. I will stress, on that again.
Okay.
For example, till 1 or 2 generations back in some communities, this thing of kala pani, that you should not cross the seas, was actually a very, very strict thing. You would lose your community. Jaat bahishkar hota tha. That has fortunately declined now. It was a good reform because in ancient times we were a seafaring civilization.
Correct.
This thing that that we do not convert others to our culture. That's not really true. How did Southeast Asia become Hindu?
Yeah.
In the first millennium, and I would argue, even if that concept came in, who's stopping us from influencing others with our culture? This could be a new reform that could come in. So modernize things that need modernizing, but keep the best of the old. And ideally, one would hope for an India the way our ancestral India was, which was robust, vigorous, outgoing, seafaring, confident, and yet not domineering.
Okay.
That balance. We
All
shouldn't be defensive.
all right. Amish, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us here on CNN News 18. Thank you.